On this episode of Faith in Focus, I have the honor and privilege of interviewing an old professor of mine, Michael McKay, from 15, 20 years ago when I was at New Tribes Bible Institute. And Michael and I talk a little bit about his health issues, and I try to trim some of that stuff out. He had a health scare. I'll link to an article that was written about that at Cedarville University's website. And so we talked a little bit about that. I tried to trim some of that stuff out. It wasn't really pertinent to the conversation, but we did end up talking about an issue that I had raised with him in an email about Paul's language in Romans 6, personifying sin almost as if it's an entity and giving specific commands to sin, and how that doesn't really translate too well to English. And so we talk about that. We talk about how Paul's theology influences a lot of the rest of the New Testament and our way of viewing the New Testament and Christian growth. So that's what we talked about. I hope you enjoy the episode. I'm looking at your bio, so if anything's not up to date, blame Cedarville University. But you've been on staff there since 2017, assistant professor of biblical theology, and you obviously, of course, went to New Tribes, which is where we met, and then went on to Grace Theological Seminary and got your doctorate from Southwestern Baptist. That's all still current, I'm
That
assuming?
is, yes.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
that's good.
So going
Uh,
into my sixth year here at Cedarville, so
okay.
enjoying it.
Yeah, and I was looking at your scholarly works. It looks like there's a couple more that I think have been added since last time we talked, but a couple on Hebrews too. Maybe I'll have to talk to you again. I've been teaching through Hebrews, and so maybe we can connect again sometime, and I can hear how wrong I am on all the things I've been
Yeah,
teaching.
yeah. I would love to talk about Hebrew. I mean, Hebrews. Two things are kind of my bread and butter academically. Hebrews is one, and then the Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint. That's the other thing I really enjoy researching. So, and thankfully they come together actually in the book of Hebrews very nicely.
Well, yeah, and I was, and yeah, and I don't want to necessarily. We can do this on another interview, but like I did see like the usage of Joshua or Jesus, and I'm assuming that this probably plays a little bit into that. That's one of the things that kind of I wouldn't say it bothers me, and maybe this is what you study and kind of sets these concerns at ease, but it does raise questions to me on issues of like how does inspiration of scripture work if we believe every word is inspired,
Mhm.
yet when somebody's like Paul is quoting something from the Old Testament, but he's not quoting Hebrew, he's quoting Greek. And sometimes those are pretty major changes. Like it can almost seems like it
Yeah.
changes the entire meaning of the passage. I'm like, well, which one was right? And yeah, so I don't know. I don't know if that's
That's a very well framed question. You are right on the money with that question. That's a good one.
yeah. And so I don't I've been talking with one of the guys I've been mentoring, and he'll ask questions like that, like, well, what do we do with the inspiration of scripture then? What does that mean? And I'm like, I don't know. Just trust God, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
but what I had initially wrote to you again, I was listening to just an old teaching of yours from Romans from back in the New Tribes days, and you had you'd said something in passing, and I think you almost even said like, but we're not going to talk about that. Like, I don't know if maybe it was too complicated to delve into with the Greek with the students. I'm not sure, so maybe it's too complicated for me to understand too. But it was the Romans 6:12. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies, so that you obey its lust. And you kind of just in passing had said how that sounds like it's a command, that's something that I, as the reader, am being told, don't let sin reign in your mortal bodies. But it's actually a third person, so it's almost like Paul's directing it at sin. And we
Oh,
don't really
gotcha.
have any corollaries in English where we would say, because any command I would give you would be a command to you, like, Michael, do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies. But he's not really talking. to you, he's talking to sin. Is what
Right.
it sounded like. Is that anywhere close to understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's a good summary. So, I mean, just to expound a little bit more on grammar, in English, like you said, we only have one type of imperative or one type of command, and it's always you based. I mean, it can be you singular, like you, Dennis, shut the door, or it could be you all, shut the door kind of thing,
Which is
plural.
just to interject, isn't that in King James when all the ye's in King James, isn't that kind of their way of translating the y'alls? Like, and
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah, they're trying to make some distinction there, which is helpful because in our modern day English, you and you doesn't communicate real well. But right, yeah, and in Greek they have the same thing. They have a second person singular and plural command, so those translate really nicely over into English. But then they also have a third person, so a third person singular, which is what we have here, or it could be even third person plural. So yeah, I mean, if we wanted to really do something awkward in our English translation, it would be, you know, sin, stop ruling in your mortal body, kind of thing. Um, so it is difficult to render into English what's going on here. To me, one of the most funny ones, maybe funny is not the right word, but is in Titus. I think it's Titus 2:15, where Paul says, "Let no one despise your youth," and that's actually a third person plural command to the congregation.
hmm,
Which is kind of interesting in a personal letter. It lets you know that probably Titus was having this letter read publicly, but then it's a command to the congregation to not despise Titus's youth. Because I don't know how Titus would actually go about causing people to not despise his youth.
yeah.
You
Well,
know?
and the way you said that, I'm just kind of like picturing myself as if picturing as if Paul was standing in the congregation giving a sermon, and he's directing a lot of it at Titus, and he keeps directing this command at Titus, but it's almost like I don't necessarily advocate that a pastor do this to his congregation, but it's almost like he's still saying "Hey Titus," but he's looking at the congregation and like being very pointed, so everyone knows. Oh, he's talking to us. He's talking to Titus, but he's really kind of talking to us right now.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to visualize the grammar because in reality, I think that's what's going on. Now, here, sin is almost personified, and so I think we're kind of forced into an English translation of for believers, you don't let sin reign. So we're adding some words to the Greek text there to make it a little bit more understandable because it seems like these commands are they do eventually shift to second person. I mean, we can continue on in the text. Verse 13, neither you, and this one's definitely second person, you present your body parts basically as instruments of unrighteousness. So now he's no longer personifying sin at all. He's talking directly to the Christians.
Okay, yeah, and so that I've been trying to wrestle through Romans 5 through 8, just that whole section on Christian growth, and it does. I agree. It seems like sin is personified almost as if it's an entity, and that's maybe not the strangest concept because all the way back in Genesis with Cain and Abel, God kind of personifies sin, and He tells Cain, "Sin's crouching at your door, and it wants to um, devour you," or whatever it says. Um, but I think like the part that I've been trying to wrestle with is how far do you take that personification because it seems like that continues on into chapter 7 when he says, so now when I sin, I can't remember the verse, it's no longer I who does it, but sin that lives within me.
Hmm.
And I'm like, okay, like I understand if he's viewing sin as a third party that is doing things or is allowed to do things, but I don't think it would be right to exempt us from culpability because just because it's somebody else. So that's kind of what I wrestle with is like how far do you push that analogy or that spiritual reality that sin is something, but it's not us, but it's in us, and it's responsible for things we do, but we're responsible for the things we do. Like how
Yeah.
where do those lines begin and end?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I do think it is a good question based on the text for sure. Personally, and this is something that I've even thought a bit more about since teaching, with New Tribes, is fundamentally, I still read the passage the same way as I did then, but I'm much more appreciative of some of the details in the text. And I think chapter 5 really sets up some of the things that you're bringing out here, where Paul says, look, when Adam sinned, or he trespassed, sin then entered the world, and then he introduces this concept of really sin and death reigning. And he uses this verb here of rule and regulation and exercising, a reign. However, when Jesus entered in and he obeyed, then life reigns, and justification reigns. And so I think that theme of if we want to call it governance or kingship or authority, carries all the way through 6, 7, and 8 in a way that I didn't appreciate as much as I do now. And I think in chapter 6, that's exactly what Paul is saying. He's like, there are these authorities out there, and he's already characterized sin and death as the kingdom that we were in. Basically, we were subservient and enslaved to that kingdom of death and sin. They're like interrelated. And then now, though, we've died with Christ, and of course, there is a reality to that doesn't remove. In other words, we can't just say, "Oh, that's a metaphor for something." It is, because I'm not physically dead. However, the reality of what he's talking about is also important, and that's that I'm freed from authority. And so this plays nicely into chapter 5, and I'm under the authority of Christ. And so when Paul says, don't let sin basically rule, because that's the same word there, don't let it have kingship over you. I think we can still personify sin. We can still treat it as an active enemy of God and of ourselves. And yet, Paul says, you and I now have the choice, to put it simply, to select who we're going to submit to. Either sin, who will produce death, and this is what Romans 6:23 is really saying, or we submit to Christ, who produces life. And I think the same thing is true in chapter 7 as well, where to your point earlier, we can't blame, if someone's going to go out and get drunk and disobey the Lord that way specifically. I'll just pick one topic and then say, oh, that's not me doing that. That's sin in me. That's not a valid excuse for Paul. Paul says, well, you have the freedom now to not submit to that master, I think is what he would say.
Yeah, I was gonna say that probably wouldn't fly if you have an affair with your spouse and say, "Well, I don't like," so I don't think it flies with God either. And as you were saying it, I kind of almost wonder if it's not a perfect analogy because like a Nazi prison guard was still the one doing things, but at the Nuremberg trials, that excuse, "I was just following orders," was kind of a deemed an illegitimate excuse. So we might choose to obey sin in the same way a Nazi prison guard might have chosen to obey orders from higher up, but that doesn't exempt that person from the choice to obey. The
Yeah.
following orders is not really a valid excuse.
Yeah, and this plays actually the back half of chapter 6. What is it, 14 to the end, is all about slavery.
Mhm.
And Paul says, "To whom you submit yourself, that's to whom you're a slave." So he's moved beyond the legal metaphor. That sin is no longer your master legally, but practically, if you're going to submit to sin as your master, then that's whom you're going to serve, and which is really common sense in that frame, because we're like, oh yeah, I mean, I may not work for, yeah, I'll just pick another university, Biola University. I work for Cedarville, but if I were to just go submit myself to Biola University and teach there, and assuming they would let me work there, then I'm actually working for whoever I'm submitting myself to, even though contractually I'm under the jurisdiction of another university. So
Yeah. And so this way of thinking, it's like I was telling somebody when we were trying to think through this. It really, I agree with you, and I think in chapter 5, I think halfway through when he starts with I think it's theologically called the federal headship, that whole Adam Christ
Mm.
thing. And from that point on, and then through chapter 8, he really is giving the most fleshed out version of his theology on sin and walking in the spirit and walking according to the flesh. And it's almost like a systematic laying out of the entire thing. And then throughout other epistles, it just kind of crops up without any explanation. And
Yes.
like in Galatians 2, that's like the flip side when he says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And he kind of just passes on through that. It's like, well, what does that mean? It's almost like the inverse of it's no longer I who does it, but sin that dwells within me. It's like the inverse of that. And if you don't really understand very intimately what he's talking about in Romans 5 through 8, you're going to just read that and it's probably not going to make a whole lot of sense. And I thought it would almost be good. And I don't know if there's any Christian universities that do this or churches that do it, but it would almost seems like it would be worthwhile, like in the ancient Greek, like where you would have like Aristotle would have his school of students where he just grounds them in his way of thinking for a long time. So everyone just thinks in an Aristotelian way. If a school just said we're going to take a semester or whatever, and all we're going to do is study this way of thinking,
Yeah.
and then so then when you're reading Galatians or something, it just is second nature. You're already thinking that way, rather than viewing it as something that's separate from all these other passages. It really informs all of Paul's thinking. So
Yeah. Well, and you know what? There, just to give a bit of evidence to maybe that was intended by uh, whoever formed the canon the way it is. So, in canon studies, we're beginning to recognize that very early on, the four gospels were put together and bound in scrolls and a codicy, a book. We have evidence of that from the second century, but Paul's letters, one of our earliest manuscripts, is actually a collection of Paul's writings.
mhm.
And we see here that there was this is second century, early order of the collection of Paul's books, and Romans heads it up, so Romans and then First and Second Corinthians. And maybe Paul himself, and I can't demonstrate this or prove it, but I'll just put it out there as a theory, a possible suggestion. Maybe Paul himself was the one who started forming a letter collection of his writings, and whoever it was, they fronted Romans. And I
Mhm.
think that we can postulate, we can entertain the idea that it was put there first in order to be a rubric, a guide for reading the rest of his epistles, just exactly like you're saying there. I'm becoming a bit more convinced of that, even though it's one of those things where you can't demonstrate it conclusively. I think there's evidence for that, and I think it's helpful.
Well, I think like another we're talking about 5 through 8, but Romans is kind of sectioned off into 1 through 3, the depravity of man, then the end of 3, 4, and beginning of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and they're really long sections where it's almost like if you want a systematic understanding of what Paul believes about the depravity of man, it's sprinkled through his other epistles, but you can go through 1 through 3 and you get the whole shebang. It's like he really makes the case, and then the same thing, salvation by faith, and then the Christian life. And even I was telling somebody, one of my guys who's been teaching through Romans at his church, they got into 9 through 11 in that section. Obviously, what God's doing with Israel and the setting aside of them temporarily, that's something that you could probably find mentioned in other epistles, but he really gives the whole explanation. And I tried to tell him, hey, when you're teaching through this, everyone gets really hung up on chapter 9 because that's where a lot of the theological quagmire is found there in chapter 9. But his it seems to me that his ultimate point is at the end of 11, when he's going to
Yeah.
come out with this fact that God has temporarily hardened Israel and he's showing grace, and this is why he's doing that. But if he'd just come out and said that, you could imagine people saying, "Come on, you can't just make a claim like that. You have to back that up." So he's kind of setting the groundwork in chapter 9. So 9 is almost, I think we get hung up the most on chapter 9 because of all the history with interpreting it, but it's really almost just background to the main point that he's trying to make in chapter 11. And so every section in Romans does seem like it's a systematic explanation of something that Paul thinks.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. I tell the students when I teach New Testament literature, I said, look, if you want to read Romans 9 through 11 well, you need to understand what question he's trying to answer, and he states that relatively early in 9. And then you also need to understand his conclusion in chapter 11. And if your reading of Romans 9 through 11 doesn't connect those two dots, the beginning and the end, then your reading is not what Paul is saying. You've missed the point. And which is unfortunate because that means that a lot of systematic theological readings of Romans 9 have missed the point,
Hmm.
because they're not reading it in light of that greater question and solution that Paul gives. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have found that it really helps when I'm trying to teach people how to study the Bible. Is you have to understand that there's a flow of thought. So why would he stop in the middle of writing to give a in-depth explanation on what we, I guess, would call election and the doctrines of grace and all that? Like
Yeah.
Calvinism. Why? And then he goes on to start. Why would he do that? What if that's what you're taking from that passage? You have to answer, why would he just stop his flow of thought and then do that? It just makes really no sense, which means you probably have the wrong interpretation or the wrong focus. And
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, and to go back to 5, 6, 7, and 8, one of the other nuances that I've just become, and I remember we've probably talked about this, you and I, but even though it is a very linear progression, and like you've used the word systematic. In other words, Paul is thoughtful in his presentation and ordered. His heart is really pastoral. I mean, the very first question out of the gate in chapter 6 is, hey, based on what I've just told you, should we go ahead and continue in sin so that grace will increase? And I just think that that is such a wonderful question that Paul asks, because if you've ever asked yourself that question, just in your own quiet heart, maybe not verbalized it, then that tells me that you've probably understood the extent of the gospel, that Paul is laying out. And my evidence for that is that Paul himself thinks the same thing. I'm getting that from Paul. And then his solution is obviously no, but he doesn't go then and say, oh, well, if you're asking that question, then you must have misunderstood what I've said. Oh, foolish mortal, or some kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
condemnation that way. Instead, he goes, don't you know? He actually gives them new knowledge. This to me is just so pastoral. It's amazing. It is the realm that we live in, particularly when we're maturing in Christ and trying to figure out. Look, I know I'm a sinner as a Christian, and I don't want to be that way. How am I supposed to grow in my walk with the Lord? How am I supposed to mature? Okay, Paul is roping you in with a question to get you to think along the same lines he is.
right. Yeah, and I think that's true, and it kind of answers a lot of those practical questions because I don't know. I tend to fall more in the category of just the thinking head knowledge. It's all theory, and you kind of err on that side. You never really answer the practical questions. But well, okay, hold on. What does this mean for my life? And
Mm.
I have a problem with sin. I didn't ask about in Christ, in sin. I didn't ask about any of that stuff.
Yeah.
I just want to know, how do I stop sinning? And so another question I had about this is because this way of viewing our relationship to sin and our relationship to Christ that he's dealing with, and there's obviously this distinction between sin and us as new believers. I always like to tell people that is it in Second Peter when Peter says that Paul says many things, they're often confusing and hard to understand, and people
Yes.
twist them, and so I always like to encourage myself and others that if you don't understand this, you're in the same boat as Peter and everyone.
Yeah.
It is difficult to understand, and so it's easy to twist and distort. And I almost wonder, do you think that because this was the Gnostics or whatever, I know they didn't really come up until later, but there was obviously some kind of early form of that going on. Were they able to gain a foothold? Because you can easily see how they're teaching that, like, you know, your sin doesn't matter. That's just sin in you or whatever, and you can do whatever you want because that's just the flesh, it's not the spirit. Was that able to take hold? Because you can easily see how you could take Paul's teaching and twist it that way, that, well, it's not you, it's just sin in you, so it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter. I mean, is that
Yeah, I can easily see how that connection would have been made, or maybe I should say it this way: that hook would have been wedged in between, some of the lines of Paul's thought. And I think the missing maybe thought there is, oh, sin is the one doing it, not me. Sin, and then here's the missing thought: sin is in my body, therefore my body is what is evil.
mhm,
And because a lot of the Gnostics would be denying the importance of the material world. They might be looking to some sort of spiritual ascension, and so they could either take one of two paths, right? They could be ascetics and deny the body, or they could, which it seems like we have some clues maybe of something like that going on in Colossians,
mm,
or they could go the other way and just indulge all of their sin, because, oh, it's just the body, it's just sin, it's not me. As the Corinthians kind of,
I was gonna
Paul,
say probably more the Corinthian route.
yeah, where they're saying, hey, food for the body or food for the belly and the belly for food. It's like, hey, this is what these were made for. Let's just do it,
Right.
and without consequence. And Paul is navigating, like you said, I don't think Gnosticism was fully formed here, so he's not necessarily navigating Gnosticism, but his, I think, a clearer reading of what he's saying is that no, both of those are wrong, because even though your body is corrupt by sin, you are still responsible for indulging sin, submitting to it, or submitting to the Lord, the King, really. I mean, when he uses the word Christos in this text, Romans 6, I personally think that that's not merely a title for Jesus. I think that's its full messianic flavor. In
Mhm.
other words, the anointed one, the Mashiach, the Messiah from the Old Testament, is the King. And so we submit ourselves to King Jesus. And because of that, we are able to, as Paul says in verse 13, to present our parts. I guess it's 13 and 14, present our parts, our body, for righteousness. So your body, in some ways, is able to experience, not a full new creation,
Right.
but you are able to you are able to participate in life as it will be in the new heavens and new earth now, to a limited degree. And this is what's so exciting about what Paul is saying: is the one who died, Jesus ultimately is also the one who's been raised from the dead. Jesus ultimately. Therefore, we have died. Metaphorically, we've shared in that freedom from sin so that we can share in that resurrection life now, even though we know one day we will we'll die physically and receive a new body,
Right.
and be able to enjoy it fully. It's all so intertwined, and it's so, we could use the fancy term eschatological if we wanted, because it's all looking for the future. It's pointing to that, but it is hardly divorced from the present. I mean, it is very pastoral as well.
Yeah, and that's kind of what um when I was trying to trace his line of thinking through this section, 7 is always kind of thrown in there as if it's just like he just deviates from his way of thinking, but I could easily see how, when you're understanding that, okay, sin's bad, I don't want to present myself to sin, then legalism could creep in from a standpoint of saying, if I just build up some walls of law, I can
Mhm.
keep sin away. And then it will be easier to not present myself to sin because I'm keeping a safe distance from sin. And then
Yeah.
Paul kind of disabuses us of that thinking by saying, no, sin is in you. Like, you can't use a law to keep sin away. It's as close to you as anything else.
Yeah.
And
Which makes it even more terrifying, really. I mean, that sin can, Paul says sin used the law to produce more sin. If I wouldn't even have known what covetous was, except for that the law said don't covet. And then whether he's talking about Israel as a whole here, which some scholars think, or his own personal failure, I think the point remains the same. Sin is so devious that it can actually use God's good law to produce more sin. And like you said, Paul's solution is not creating better laws. It's actually walking by the Spirit.
Yeah, and then in chapter 8, when he comes to the answer of walking according to the Spirit, I mean, the Spirit is just as close to us, if we want to use that language, as sin is, maybe even closer. I mean, he says in 1 Corinthians, we become one spirit with him. So there's a pretty intimate connection there. And he even says, the Spirit who raised Christ from the dead will bring life to your mortal bodies. And I always have kind of understood that to mean he's just saying, like, well, one day you're going to die and Jesus will give you, eternal life again, and he'll raise your body from the dead. But it seems more like he's saying, no, he'll, like, this death that you're experiencing in your mortal body, it's like this body right now, you can actually have life in that same mortal body, the eternal life that Jesus is talking about. He's not just talking about raising your body from the dead, but I mean, he does later in Romans 8, I guess. But he's really saying, no, you can experience life. You're not just condemned to an experience of death. You can actually have life in your physical mortal bodies.
Yeah, I mean, that's mind-boggling, isn't it? I mean, and that's really, if we could continue to, what's the word I'm looking for? There's this idea, there's a paradigm shift, I guess, within Christianity, that we often think, well, I'm forgiven for my sins and I will be in heaven with God when I die. Those are true statements, no doubt about it. But those are really, that's really such a summary of what Jesus has done that misses the detail. It's almost like you've summarized the Lord of the Rings by saying something like it's about little guys throwing away jewelry to, save the world. You're like, well, yeah, but it's way more than that. You've ruined the story in your summary. Yeah. And I think that kind of summary of Christianity is ruining the story as well. I mean, it demeans Jesus, and it also demeans what we're supposed to be doing now, because, like you said, we have life now, which is not a ticket to living a long time. It's actually a quality of life, and that's what the Spirit provides in a pretty amazing way.
Yeah, I agree. Well, alrighty, well, Mike, that was good. It answered some. I mean, it doesn't answer all of them, because, like I said, I think I'll probably be wrestling with this whole section forever, because it's just so difficult to understand and apply and understand the nuance of all of it. But like I said, I wanted to keep it to about 30 minutes. I think that's about 45 minutes right now. So.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Well, the recording thing says 45 minutes, but I think we were bantering about other stuff to start with. So, but maybe sometime in the near future we can have you back on before your hoses run out. I'm just kidding. And talk about Hebrews and talk about Hebrews and some of that other stuff. Maybe the inspiration question, as far as how Greek and Hebrew and all that stuff connects together, because that stuff interests me and confuses me. So.
Oh, hey, I would absolutely love that, Dennis. I appreciate your specific and excellent way of thinking through the text here. These are great questions. And just if I could say one little maybe foreshadowing for the inspiration question, that's a question I'm actively looking into. So I feel comfortable giving a few options here, but I'm still thinking through it. So it's an open question for me as well.
I always tell people there's a lot of things that I teach that way, that you should always just understand to have an asterisk. It's yes. Like subject to change upon, and because I've had people say, well, you taught this, 5 years ago, and this is what you said then. And I say, well, I must have learned something between now and then. Or
that's right. The game's not over yet.
Yeah, for sure. So, all right, Mike, it was good talking to you, and we'll stay in touch.
Same here, brother. Take care.
Right, and bye-bye.
While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission. If you like what you heard on this episode, why don't you become a monthly supporter of the ministry? It really helps me out. $10 a month, or whatever the Lord lays on your heart. So if you're interested in becoming a partner, you can text the word discipleship to 41444, or head over to infaith.org/Dennis-Southerby. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to address on a future episode of Faith in Focus, why don't you shoot me an email? You can email me at dennissoutherby@infaith.org. Just put in the subject line, question for Faith in Focus or something like that. So I can see it, know that it's from you, and know that it's an issue that you would like me to address.